James, I'm very glad we finally managed to get this chat, okay? It's going to be a chat, very informal. But it's very important because you're probably one of the most prolific businessmen, philanthropists, diaspora and Armenian businessmen, philanthropists who has worked in Armenia almost 30 years. You have a wonderful hotel chain, 4 of them functioning, the 5th under construction in Areni. By the way, I see it every time I pass by Areni to go to Vayotzor. You have helped revive a very interesting ancient Armenian tradition of carpet weaving, but it's not just weaving. What fascinates me is the process of the full value chain, from gathering the wool, from making the thread, from dyeing it, from weaving it. It's an entire industry from scratch, every downstream, upstream that you have managed to revive. And you have the Tufenkian Foundation, which is itself one of the most prolific foundations in terms of getting involved in every type of social good, civic society, schools, healthcare, resettlement of people, especially in Artsakh, and building homes, taking care of wounded soldiers, and so on and so forth. And most recently, you've gotten into the real Armenian tradition of winemaking, and which is probably the crowning of your achievements. Now, I'd like to talk about these things a lot. I'd like to talk about largely about the Tufenkian Foundation activities because they've changed so many lives here in Armenia. But first, I'd like to start on a very personal note, okay? Because our audience of this series is usually very interested in what motivates someone, a diasporan Armenian, to come. What is the connection with Armenia? What is the connection with Artsakh, especially in your case? And because each has a different story. Some are personal, some are historic, some are identity issues. It would be fascinating to hear your side. What's your connection to Armenia?
Okay, thank you, Vahan. Let me go back a bit in my life. I actually grew up until I was about 20 years old, hardly being Armenian. My last name wasn't Armenian. I wasn't Tufenkian at that time. And I really didn't know anything about our history. But I came a day when I happened on a book about the genocide, and that changed everything for me. I just, I couldn't believe the horror of it, the injustice of it, that it was unacknowledged, and that was my people and my past. So I think also I had a sense that, especially having grown up in non-Armenian communities, that there was a process of assimilation going on among Armenians who had survived the genocide, and that if I allowed myself to continue being part of that assimilation, I was really helping the Turks to fulfill their mission.
That's incredible.
Calling it the white genocide, after the red genocide. So I decided that I was going to become Armenian, and I came to New York I grew up in Oregon. I came to New York at least partly because I wanted to be part of Armenian community and get connected. So anyway, to fast forward to the early 90s, I had started my first business in the 80s on this carpet business, which became quite successful pretty fast. And I remember I was just starting to enjoy the fruits of my labor, and I finally had money to spend, and I was enjoying a nice lifestyle in New York. And I remember during the war just seeing the suffering of the people. I mean, when the shelling of Stepanakert, the Armenians living in basements trying to escape, the brave struggle of all kinds of Armenians fighting back for their land, for their lives. And I felt really guilty sitting in New York enjoying my life. So I just came to a point and I said, I have to get off my butt and I have to do something. What Armenia needed at that time was really, it really needed jobs. This was in '93 when I came here for the first time. The war was still on. And the biggest thing, there was no economy, there was no jobs, everything was collapsed.
I remember those years, yeah.
Yeah, you remember.
Those were the worst years, probably, 93, 94.
Absolutely, absolutely. A very interesting time to start a business in Armenia. I came in with the intention of putting a lot of people to work and so forth. That was the real goal. I mean, the motivation came from the struggle in Artsakh, and that's really what brought me here.
James, let's come to the Tufenkian Foundation, because that the diversity of activities of Tufenkian Foundation really fascinates me, both in Armenia but also in Artsakh. I've visited Artsakh right before the war with the Tufenkian team. It was a fascinating trip. I saw firsthand with my own eyes what the foundation was doing, especially the part about building homes for wounded soldiers and resettling different parts. But there's no question that after the last war, I don't know what percentage, but some of those efforts that you've spent so many years building went to naught, right? And anyone else would have said, look, this is hopeless, would have given up. But as far as I can see, foundation has actually increased its activities now. And say now the need is even more. And now there is more need to motivate, to encourage the people there and to salvage whatever is left. Tell us, what is it that drives the foundation? What is it that drives you, even after this latest setback, to continue with the same effort?
Well, the mission is no different. I mean, the need to preserve Artsakh, the importance of that land to Armenia, to our history, to our culture, and to our future is no different than it was back then. And so, I mean, how can we just turn our backs on the mission? You know, it's a difficult period in which to be working there just because there's so much uncertainty. And government action is so ineffective at this particular time. But again, it's just a continuation of the same mission and the commitment that we undertook in the 90s.
What percentage of all your good in the last 20 years in Artsakh has been lost?
Well, look, let's skip the material part at the beginning and just say our work now and our work then was a lot about building hope and hope in the future for the people there. To reward them for their perseverance and their sacrifices. Many of the people we helped fought in the war, were injured in the war, had family members that died in the war. And from the beginning, we were always supporting those people, and they're still alive, you know. We lost a lot of the material stuff that was there. I mean, our main goal in Artsakh was in liberated territories. We were rebuilding and resettling people. And the idea was creating facts on the ground that might make it more difficult for those lands ever to be given away.
I just spent 4 or 5 days in Artsakh, and one thing I agree with you 100%, it makes a huge difference for these people, for the local Artsakh people, to see Armenians come and be interested in them. It makes the world difference, the psychological impact. But all that put aside, the psychological impact and so on, at the end of the day, we're facing a very dire security situation. At the moment, Armenia itself has some trouble defending its borders. Artsakh is just sitting there, totally at the mercy of the Russian peacekeepers. And there are attempts. I mean, one thing that the current government is doing is trying to find all kinds of alternatives or diversify its strategic alliances. But frankly, I personally, I don't know about you, that's why I want to ask you, but I personally don't see a lot of short-term solutions to the security problem, and where are we headed right now? How do you see it?
The scary thing is that we're in this perilous situation and we're down to short-term solutions. We didn't create long-term solutions over the last 30 years. And that's really what's so terrible about the situation we're in and why we're so weak. It's also why so much of the population and diasporans and so forth have really mobilized with a lot of energy that maybe they didn't have before now, because we really realize, I mean, if it wasn't clear enough after the 2020 war, it was after September 13, that now our actual borders are under attack and we don't know where it's going to stop.
I've seen many countries come out of military setbacks. I wouldn't even call it major defeats, but setbacks. Come out, get back on their feet, remotivate the people, regroup, remobilize, and try to confront a very bad situation with new hope, with new vigor. Unfortunately, I haven't seen that in the Armenian society. I shouldn't say that because I think in some parts of society it exists, but in other parts there's this almost coalescence that, okay, either this was bound to happen, this was inevitable, we couldn't have done much, and so on. It's all justification of past mistakes. And as you said, mistakes are accumulated over 30 years. But I think it's worth thinking in terms of what can be done to remotivate both the people and some of the decision makers to have a more assertive position towards all this. I mean,
well, look, decision makers is the whole problem. I mean, I hate to just come out and say it, but the failures primarily are on the part of the government, and not just this government, but 30 years of government. And what I see around me is lots and lots of people who, again, were very energized by the 2020 war, and even more so lately. And you have this very odd phenomenon going on. You're talking about people remobilizing and so forth. This very odd phenomenon of the private sector here, recognizing that we have important life or death issues and the government isn't going to fix them. So we have to take on, and it's silly as it seems, a lot of the work that government normally does and should do just because we can't just sit and do nothing. And I don't know if you don't see it, but I see it all around me in defense industry and public relations and messaging, I mean, just all kinds of initiatives that people have joined together. And this is another big thing. One of my friends during the 2020 war was going around and preaching a really great message, and he was saying, this is time for Armenians to come together, that we need to merge, not divide, you know, and didn't mean even political division. It's like every Armenian likes to go his own way. We all have our own ideas. We all want to pursue our own ideas. And that's fine in a way, but in crisis situations, you know, there's strength in numbers and unifying your energies. And that message really stuck on a lot of people, and I really believe it, and that's what I see happening is these informal networks of people. I mean, I'm involved with 5 or 6 of them, and everybody involved are involved with 5 or 6 more, and we're always leaning on each other and getting support. So I have a lot of, I mean, I can't say this is going to be enough to change our security situation. If we have time, it could help. But the real idea is that if we create some of these, if we advance the fight in some of these areas like defense and so forth, when the government is ready, when the right time comes, they can absorb some of this stuff, and instead of starting from scratch themselves, they can be, you know, 2 or 3 years along and take it over. So this is what gives me hope in the present time. And it's also, I'm sorry, you know, the alternative is to sit and do nothing, and that's just, how can anybody do that at this time?
Absolutely.
The only way I can sleep at night is by knowing I'm doing what I can.
There is this interesting disconnect. There are a couple of disconnects. First, there is a disconnect between the technical capabilities that are under the disposal, at the disposal of Armenia, and the use of those capabilities in the military.
Right.
There is a disconnect, second level of disconnect between these private initiatives that you're talking about, which also give me a lot of hope, by the way, and the ability of those private initiatives to kind of spread themselves into the broader decision-making apparatus. And there's a lot of what people here are proud of, and I am also, what they call islands of excellence. Now, islands of excellence are fine in and of themselves, but unless they impact beyond their little island to the rest of the country, they stay there. They stay there. And today Armenia does not have the luxury of that level of specialization. We'll come back to what we should do, okay? But you're not just a man of New York and Armenia. You're a man of the world. You've been all over. I know you go to Asia a lot. I know you follow global trends a lot. And one of the things that has changed in this region in the past few years is the overall geopolitical structure, the whole situation where, especially after the Ukraine war, Russian influence is kind of on the wane, partly because they're distracted, partly because they're undergoing substantial cost. I think globally, US influence has waned also. Especially if I look at the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, certain places, they don't have the clout they used to, the United States. At the same time, I look in the region here, at least there is a contest to gain influence on the part of Turkey and Azerbaijan. They've become very cocky, very arrogant, especially after the last victory. So something has changed here, okay? And at the same time, Iranian-Armenian relations have become more closer. Looking at it from a global geopolitical perspective, the changes in the world, how do you think they are affecting and they will affect Armenia and the Caucasus?
Well, you said a lot of it. I mean, one of the encouraging things, which is also problematic coming out of all this, is United States engagement and actual interest in the region. I think we all understand that they are seeing an opportunity here to pull Armenia out of the Soviet orbit, and maybe they understand something that some of my activities have been pushing, which is the idea that there's a democratic duopoly in the Caucasus between Georgia and Armenia. And either of us alone is going to have a hard time surviving, but the two of us together, if supported from the West, can actually survive and maybe then influence the countries around us in the future. And I see a real interest in the United States and Europe in pushing that. Now, having said that, we know, I mean, our big geopolitical problem, and I don't blame our government for being confused about how to deal with this. I mean, there's a good reason why all Armenians look first to Russia in terms of understanding what's going on here, what's going on in the region, and what our future looks like. They are the big guy in the neighborhood. And the good thing about it for us is that they have a real geopolitical interest in our territory. You know, whether they like us or not, whether they like our government or not, they really want to have influence in this region. And that's probably not ever going to change just because of geography. The problem with the United States and the idea of leaning on it is that they're way over there. Okay, first problem is it's a so-called democracy where in every 4 years the tide can completely turn. At this particular time, they're very interested in Armenia and democracy and whatever. In 4 years, they may not be. So if we pack our bags and line up with them right now and get some benefits, who knows what happens in 4 years? So this is really the dilemma, which I'm sure the Armenian government is facing every day and trying to figure out how to negotiate.
Of course, my dilemma here is this. Armenia needs the best technology it can find on planet Earth when it comes to defense. Okay, the best technology on planet Earth when it comes to defense is Western. Okay, you put that there. So that's a no-brainer, which kind we should have. But then behind the pure technological aspect, the physical aspect, there's the policy aspect. And how much, like you said, how much can you rely on the sources of that best technology that they will maintain their interest, or what they want here is the same as what you want? Okay? For example, I've noticed that as far as the United States is concerned, let's say, any solution to the Karabakh problem is fine, because solution means the problem is over and the role of Russia has declined. But for Armenia, any solution is not fine. And for me, it's not fine. Right. So there is a divergence of priorities and interests, even though I still believe the future of Armenia on the technological level, on the not just scientific technology, but even governance technology, processes, administrative methods. The future has to be Western, cannot be, you know, we've seen the Eastern.
Well, and unfortunately, you know, we had a lot of what turned out to be illusions about the competence of the Russians in many ways. And for a long time, it looked like they might be a possible really good buddy for us, you know, in technology, especially in military. This has all become, you know, pretty clear that they're not. So unfortunately, that's why when people talk about, you know, Armenia staying in the Russian orbit and leaning that way, the question is, what do they really have to offer us, you know? And even in defense, what really is their capability at this point in time?
Yeah. Well, in that sense, since we're talking about the geopolitics, I believe in the last couple of years there has been a much stronger agreement or synchronization of policy between Turkey, Russia, and Azerbaijan. And every time those three come together, we suffer. And this is not going to be any difference.
That's historical, right?
Yeah.
At least Turkey and Russia.
What do we do? Partly, what do we do as individuals, which we're not doing it yet, or partly as a country, as a nation. Now, there's a lot of talk about how do we engage the diaspora more. What is it we could do that we're not doing?
Well, the first question is who's the we we're talking about? Because if it includes the government, then there's a whole bunch of things that could be done better. And probably job one is to have a bit better democratic system here and to work towards a better, more technocratic government, whether it comes under the current regime or in a future one. And I think even the current government would like that to happen. It's just difficult for them to understand how to make it happen. But then there's the private sector, and I don't have a big prescription, but I have to say, I mean, the way I live my life since 2020 is basically every day I wake up and ask myself, what have I done for Armenia lately, you know? And I hate to say this, but I have a lot of impatience for people who are talking about a lot of things, people making long-term plans, making grand strategies without thinking about how it's going to get implemented. Because everything has to be action-oriented now. Every Armenian in and out of the government has to think about action. And our time frame is really narrow, our window of opportunity is really narrow. We have to be totally focused on action and results now. And if everybody gets on board with that, I think it'll make a big difference. Even if only the private sector, if the diaspora gets on board with it, it'll make a big difference.
Well, part of the reason people analyze and prescribe without action is because they're not empowered to act, right? There are now many initiatives here in Armenia with new think tanks, new strategy, policy platforms.
Who's going to implement them is the question.
Exactly. But those people who are doing that, that's their specialty. You know, they're policy wonks or analysts or strategists.
They need to somehow team with people who can make things happen.
That's another disconnect, okay?
And the idea, you know, that a lot of people want to do these prescriptions for the government, and that's great because government needs a lot of help, but like you give them a prescription which is at college level when they're functioning as at, you know, elementary school level, it's just not, there's no point to it. Unless you have a way to provide the way to get to the goals or accomplish the results you're looking for, there's just almost no point, you know?
The sad news is that disconnect is even within the government.
Absolutely.
Ministries don't always talk to each other. Within the same ministry, different branches don't always talk to each other, let alone with outside sources. You and I cannot go and fix this, right? I mean, I wish we could, but
well, actually, I'll bring up an example. I mean, to some extent, this is fixable about the functioning of the ministries. And I'll bring up Sarah Anjargolian as an example. She's been working inside of the Ministry of Health for, I think, a year now, with the goal of trying to create a model reform of a government ministry and doing it with the full cooperation of the Minister of Health. And she's brought in several really top diasporans into key positions in the ministry, along with some ECORDS fellows, to try from inside to reform it and help to make it really good functioning, and in the process to maybe provide a model for how other ministries can be reformed. And I think this is absolutely an effort that the private sector could engage in more. You know, some big donors, clever business people could take over a ministry, I think, quite easily. I don't mean take over in the sense of controlling it, but just say, okay, I'm going to work with the minister and provide resources to help them reform. And that would be one really constructive thing that would make a big difference in the country.
Well, the unfortunate situation right now is that we have an ineffective opposition. Let's talk about that for a second. The opposition, political opposition, especially the parliamentary political opposition, has only two jobs right now. First, provide the public with a viable, believable, credible alternative.
Right.
Which they've miserably failed at.
They never talk about policy. It's always personal.
Yeah. And second, at least have enough be effective enough to at least modify the government's, as an opposition from within, modify the government's action. They have failed. No.
Makes you question their motives. I mean,
it makes me question everything. How can it be this ineffective as an opposition? And but you look at the government, they have right now, from my perspective, from a country that just came out with huge losses from war, they have only 3 jobs. 1, defend your borders. 2nd, really inspire the population, get them out of this defeatist thing and get them back kind of on their feet. And then motivate the nation as a whole to confront, to see the hope of a better future. Motivate them, give them that. And you know what? They failed at all 3. So here we are, a government that has failed at its main tasks, an opposition that has miserably failed at its 2 tasks. At the same time, I see Armenia as the big gap, as there's no really credible, independent, intellectual leadership that people take seriously. Frankly, between us, well, it's not between us, but there's no credible, believable spiritual leadership that can come to the assistance of the people at a time like this when they're demoralized and so on. So in a situation like this, I don't really blame the public for just, being kind of giving up, being indifferent, having fed up and so on.
I have to say, I don't want to accept the idea that the public is that defeated and disillusioned and so forth. Because I see too many examples of people who are just fighting and forging ahead.
There's exceptions, no question.
Well, I don't know if they're exceptions, but okay. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
We'll see at the next elections if people have real alternatives.
This is another opportunity. It's like the part of the problem that we're in right now is that there aren't good alternatives in within the political sector, and this is something that somebody or some group can work on, is bringing up, new leaders for the country, if that's what we need.
Thank you very much for this conversation, and we shall continue, and we're not giving up.
Yeah, thanks, Vahan. And I just want to say, whatever I do here is part of a really broad team of people, and everybody is contributing what they can. It's like maybe I have more resources, and in certain ways I can contribute, but the main thing is we're all doing what we can, and I think that's how we make a change.
Thank you.